This is Jeremy Bassetti, and you're listening to Travel Writing World, a podcast featuring interviews with travel writers about their work and about the business and craft of travel writing. You can find the episode show notes, free travel writing resources, and much more at travelwritingworld.com. In 1956, Eric Newby quit his job in the fashion industry to explore Nuristan, a remote region in the northeast of Afghanistan. Newby wrote about his journey in his now classic book, A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, originally published in 1958 to wide acclaim. Joining me to talk about Newby's A Short Walk is Aaron Millar, who has written for publications like National Geographic Traveller and is the host of the Armchair Explorer podcast. Well, Aaron, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm psyched to be on. I'm a big fan of your show.
Thanks. And so we're here to talk about Eric Newby's A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, which is considered to be one of, the classic travel books in the post-World War II period. So this is the second podcast in the series where I talk with travel writers about travel books that are well regarded. But before we jump into that, I wanted just to give you the opportunity to introduce yourself to the listeners. You are the host of a podcast called Armchair Explorer. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself and about your podcast?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. My name's Aaron Millar. I'm a travel writer. I originally hail from England, so I've always been a big fan of Newby. He's a classic travel writer from my home turf, but I ran away to the Rocky Mountains of Colorado about 7 years ago, and they can't have me back. We get the 300-day sunshine a year here, and I think England gets the other 65, so I'm not going anywhere. But I thank you for asking about the podcast. It's called Armchair Explorer. The hook of the show is the world's greatest adventurers tell their best story from the road. And if I could have had Eric Newby on the show, that probably would have been my dream guest. So this will have to suffice, I guess. But it's been a lot of fun doing the podcast. I kind of come from a traditional travel writing background, working for newspapers and magazines. And it's been really fun just starting to tell these adventure stories and try and connect people with the outdoors and just the pure joy of exploration. It's been really fun to do that in a new medium. And I'm a big fan of podcasts and travel podcasts and a big fan of yours too. So I'm honored to be on the show.
Thanks. Well, your podcast is definitely well put together in the ways in which you and your guests tell stories. So we are fans of your show over here too.
Well, thank you. And I think we've kind of had parallel lives because I used to work in the music industry, and one of the reasons I wanted to and work in music, and I'm still a huge fan of music and music production, and one of the reasons why I wanted to do my show is I wanted to kind of mix storytelling with music, and you're a musician too, so I'm publicly now going to hit you up for some of your music on my show.
That was a former life. We're not allowed to talk about such things here.
Oh, we're not allowed to talk about former lives. I'm so sorry.
Okay, well, and so can you just give us before we talk about Newby, can you tell us where we can find your podcast online?
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, it's available, Apple, Google, Stitcher, all the usual places, or you can go to the website armchair-explorer.com. Very good.
So let's, set the stage and talk about who this wonderful character Eric Newby was. I think we all know that he's a British travel writer who kind of rose to fame and prominence in the post-World War II period. He's sold over 1 million paperbacks. He's, well regarded, many, many travel books. And I think the one that we're talking about, A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, was one of his breakout books.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's just the most incredible character, really. He has the most amazing story, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of highlight him in the show today. He's, and I think this comes through the book as well, he's kind of this boy's own adventurer. He's kind of a generation. I guess he was probably born at the tail end of the Victorian era, Edwardian era. And there's something of that kind of style and ethos, that very old-fashioned Englishness that comes through this story, and just his kind of spirit for adventure, which sort of borders on naivety in many places in this book. But he's sort of self-effacing throughout that in a very stiff upper lip kind of way, which I love. But he's had the most incredible life. You know, he left school at 16, which was not uncommon then, and actually still is in England in many ways. And he ended up working on this like traditional sailing ship. He had kind of read these stories about these great kind of maritime adventures, and he sort of just did it and ended up on this kind of ship doing what's called the grain race, taking grain and wheat over to Australia, and had all sorts of incredible adventures. He wrote about that in the Great Grain Race, and then the war came, and that's kind of where his story gets just absolutely fascinating. He was really an elite soldier. He was in the SBS, the Special Boat Service, which is like the brother organization of the SAS, which is England's super high elite fighting force, a little bit like the Green Berets or something like that. So I mean, he was a serious guy in that sense, and he had this incredible mission quite early on in the war, where he was sent with just 5 other men to a kind of port that the Germans had owned, where
to blow up a series of planes, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's like some kind of if it wasn't real life, you would think this would be some sort of exaggerated Hollywood version of it, right? And it gets better too. You know, they almost succeed, but he's ultimately captured and taken to an Italian prisoner of war camp, and then it kind of gets all crazy because he escapes from the prisoner of war camp. And actually, one of the people that helps him escape the first time is this woman that he meets who's living there. She's not Italian, but she's living there, and her name is Wanda. And she will appear later in this book too, because Wanda eventually becomes his wife, which has to be one of the greatest romance stories of all time. I mean, I don't know what your kind of meet your wife story is, but mine certainly doesn't measure up to helped me escape from prisoner of war camp,
right.
You know? And then he actually has to disguise himself as an Italian kind of shepherd boy and lives in the Apennine Mountains, which I'm desperate to read this book afterwards. I really wanted to do, as you say, Short Walk in the Hindu Kush is this kind of breakout classic book. It's probably the book that he'll be best remembered for. But Love and War in the Apennines is when he writes about this story. And I really, having read this now, I'm desperate to read that too, because it's an incredible story. It's an incredible kind of war story on one level, but it's really a love story as well. And it kind of puts Romeo and Juliet to shame in some ways because, he's having these secret messages with Wanda and secret meetings that kind of really risk his life. And there's one sort of notable scene in it too. I think it's quite a poignant book as well, because there's one notable scene where he actually gets discovered by a German soldier all alone just in the Apennine Mountains, which is a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. I did a story about them a while ago, and walking this old salt road over the Apennine Mountains into the sea. And it is this very beautiful, remote, very, very traditional Italian place. And he's in these mountains when he gets kind of discovered, but he ends up sitting down with this German soldier who agrees not to turn him in. And they have a conversation about the war, just 2 young men. And it just sort of says something about his character that he's able to do that. And so it really, this book is kind of prefaced by this incredible life and this incredible adventure prior to even embarking on this journey.
And we should say, before he was captured in Italy, he was sent to India and he learned Hindi and Urdu, and then was sent to North Africa, from which he embarked on the mission where he got captured. And after he escaped into the Apennine Mountains, he was recaptured and sent to another prisoner of war camp in Germany, right? And so after the war, I think the story goes, he was sent back into Europe, supported by British finances, to kind of seek out the anti-fascist sympathizers and supporters. And that's how he got back in touch with Wanda.
That's right, isn't it? Yeah, I love that part of the story.
They tracked her down, and then they never separated since that moment. And interestingly, after this badass, like hyper masculine kind of career, he goes back to England, where he spends the next decade or so working in the fashion industry, the haute couture fashion industry, right?
I just love this about him, though, too. It's such a rebel thing to do in a strange way, isn't it? Because as you say, he's come from this hugely macho background, and yeah, and I love how he describes, in a typical kind of stiff upper lip English way of his time. He describes like his second capture as quite disagreeable or something like that. It's like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would be quite disagreeable. It sort of like puts your long bus journeys that you would describe like that to shame, isn't
it? My back hurt. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
But so the reason why we're recounting his story is because this is where A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush begins. Is in the middle, or rather at the very end of his tenure in the fashion industry. He's working on, I think, some new line. Was it like a summer or a spring collection? And he just, got the call of the wild. He got frustrated with his work in the fashion industry and sent a telegram to his friend Hugh. And it said just simply, "Can you travel Nuristan June?"
I love that.
Right.
I wish we still paid by the word, for text now. It'd be so much simpler, wouldn't it?
Right.
Forget grammar, forget all the niceties. Like, let's get to the point.
Cut to the chase, right?
But that's one of the things that I love about this book too. Is it's just this kind of all of a sudden mad right turn in life. Here he's got a very successful career in the fashion industry, and like you said, he's been there for about a decade. And the book kind of opens with this scene. And actually, I think one of the things that Newby does incredibly well as a writer is he captures characters and dialogue just brilliantly, and as well as any novelist. And so I think at times you really get that sense that you're almost reading a novel because it's so well paced and the dialogue is so on point and it's so well balanced that it's a real page turner. But it opens with this incredible scene of him in like high fashion in London, and you just get a total sense of what that life is like. They're going to luncheon and I think that, and it sets its time so perfectly too. Like they call each other formally by their names, and Mr. Hyde Clark and Miss Candlemas, the American buyer who comes in, and having worked in the music industry, I had a lot of affiliation for how he felt in that time, because here's this very important American buyer, and they've said, she can only come at this time, and they change all their plans, and then she arrives like 4 hours late and doesn't want to see any of the things that she says. She wants to see something completely different, and steals a bottle of perfume basically, and presumes it's going to be given to her, and it just rung so true about so much of that kind of London, and I'm sure elsewhere, those capital cities, but that sort of fashion industry type atmosphere, which felt, he managed to write it in a way that felt very, very funny and very true, but also you got a little bit of that claustrophobia that he felt. You got a little bit of that sense of, God, I need to break out of this too. I can understand, why he's wanting to escape from this life in a way, and then through this, as you say, is that famous cable, the famous telegram that he sends to Hugh Carless, who is just the best character, isn't he? Just reading Hugh is just the funniest. I don't know if he's intentionally funny, but I took him as just a real kind of iconic English gentleman kind of character, and just I had so much fun with him.
Yeah, but also with a short temper. I think he has a short temper. At least he's portrayed to have a short temper by Newby, which we can talk about a little bit later. But if it sounds like we're smiling and giggling, it's for a reason, because the book is a funny book, right? It's meant to be tongue-in-cheek. It's meant to be humorous, right? Even the title alludes to it. It's A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush, right? A short, right? Chapter titles like Life of a Salesman and Death of a Salesman allude to kind of the comic quality. So this isn't, a serious travel book. It's not serious minded. You're not going to get a lot of kind of like historical or cultural insights from reading this book. But what you are going to get is this, wonderful comedic tale of kind of two bumbling foreigners getting into situations that are
I think that's well said.
It has a very kind of Idiot Abroad feel to it, does it not? Have you seen that show?
I have. I hadn't thought of that parallel, but I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, it kind of does, but it's also I think it also says quite a lot about the sort of naivety and arrogance of that time, particularly the English man, gentleman at that time. That there's sort of mention of the empire and all this stuff. There was a sense, I suppose, that they could do anything. That there was a real sense of being powerful and competent. But he manages to not be arrogant in that he's so self-effacing and kind of makes fun of himself and Hugh throughout it, that I think that it manages to not come across that way. He sort of laughs at himself as he does it. Although there are a few instances, I'm sure we'll mention that time maybe hasn't treated well. This was obviously a trip that happened in the late 50s, and the book came out in the late 50s, so it's a very different time from now. But yeah, they are kind of idiots abroad. There's such a naivety to the way they approach this, and I think that's one of the fun things about this book too. Is on the one hand, there's something kind of inspirational about the fact that he was just able to kind of quit this career and go on this crazy adventure. And that kind of made me feel, as I read it, God, it is possible to do mad things like that, right? It's possible to just pack it all in and decide, no, you know what? Going to one of the most remote regions in the world is more important than this 10-year career in the fashion industry I've built up. But yeah, there's also this incredible naivety that runs throughout it, particularly with the kind of mountaineering climbing aspect.
I mean, the entire premise of this book is, in some ways, two people who don't really have any experience climbing mountains or hiking have this kind of bold plan to go climb one of the most formidable regions in the planet, right? Inhospitable. They want to climb Mir Samir, it's with a 19,000 foot mountain peak. They have these grand plans to summit that, and they have absolutely no experience climbing. And in fact, they go to Wales for like 3 or 4 days to learn the ropes, literally, about how to climb.
I know. I love it. There's one like sort of passage where he's, because basically Newby had wanted to go and see Nuristan, this kind of pretty much undiscovered, unexplored region in Afghanistan, and Hugh had written to him about it previously when Hugh had been stationed in I think in Kabul, and so that was the kind of initial idea. And then Hugh comes back and says, "No, we must climb this mountain." So he really gives this impression that he's this experienced sort of mountaineer, and everything's going to be fine. And Newby keeps kind of, protesting and saying, no. And he just keeps getting letters back with like shopping lists of mountaineering equipment he's to buy. It's just absolutely ignored in any of his like pleas to sensibility. But yeah, I think they're leaving on June the 1st, and it's the end of May, and they have 4 days, and they think, golly, we best go learn how to climb, and so they find themselves in this B&B in Wales, and it's just very funny that first there's a local doctor who agrees to take them out, and then I think it's a couple of the women that work at the B&B take them out, but it's so like the stuff that they're doing is very sort of basic. Like if you've ever climbed I've done a fair bit of climbing, and if you've ever gone to an indoor gym for half an hour, you would know more than they do, and yet they're going to like an unclimbed peak in one of the most remote and dangerous places in the world, and just kind of happily, you don't know what you don't know. Isn't that true? And I think they don't know so much that they don't even know it. But yeah, I thought that was very, very funny. And also just, there's a funny passage where he's abseiling down this cliff, and they have to do it. These are days really before we had a lot of the modern mountaineering equipment that we have now. So, they're having to kind of put the rope between his legs, and he's kind of hanging there in agony as this rope is grinding between his legs. And you just have this impression of these two guys who have, the local waitresses are trying to teach them, and they have absolutely no idea what's going on. And any sensible person that kind of even moderately loved their life and being alive would have quit at that point, right? That weekend would have been like, no, we can't get up this 100-foot cliff in Wales. We are not going to climb a 20,000-foot mountain in Afghanistan. It's just not going to happen. But but it's it's that spirit of, we can do anything and stop being such a wuss, and that kind of carries them forward. And so they go on, but luckily Judith, one of the waitresses, before they go, just kind of passes them a climbing pamphlet. It's described. I just have this image of like one of those little fold out sort of train map type things that has like the do's and don'ts of climbing.
Don't forget to do your safety knot, right?
This is how to belay. This is how not to belay. Right. And it's lucky she did, because like that will become their Bible. I mean, they actually consult this numerous times on the mountain when they don't know what to do. So I think it was a great start to the book, and that's kind of the first part of the book, isn't it? And I think by the end of that, you're really on their side, but you also sort of can't believe what they're doing, and you're excited to take off with them.
And interestingly, his wife Wanda says, "Hey, I want to go with you," right? And she attaches herself onto the group, and I think she makes it all the way to Tehran. She doesn't make it to Afghanistan, but she makes it most of the way, which is interesting. And I later found out that Wanda, in subsequent travels, went with Newby almost everywhere, right? He preferred not to travel alone, as many travel writers prefer. He always wanted to go with Wanda and had no problems taking her. And apparently she was tough as nails, like Newby, so she could hold her own. But that was a fascinating part of the story. I didn't expect her to want to go and to actually go. I guess that says a lot about our culture of expectations around gender. But for her, she's the reason why he's still alive. She's the reason why he escaped. She's a strong anti-fascist woman who, helped this guy and many other prisoners escape. So I found that an interesting element. Although she plays a very small kind of role in the story, this is something that stuck out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, it's a marker of how unusual it was. You could kind of get Hugh's reaction to that was like, what? You want to take your wife, and does his best to try and talk him out of it and her out of it. But she comes. And I think that's great too. I thought that was just a really nice part of that illustrated, their love story. Yeah. And she doesn't stay the whole time. They have kids at this time too. So I like that they just sort of pack their kids off to someone and off they go for a month to Istanbul and around. And like you say, it's not a pleasant trip either. And I think it really speaks to, that her sort of toughness, like you said, and her bravery to want to be there and be a part of the adventure, to just not want to miss out, So it's I love that too. Although Hugh almost does kill her with an ice cream. So I like throughout all this that he reminds me of my dad in some ways, who's just got, like, through sheer force of will, just refuses to get sick, and it's like this very kind of traditional English thing, of stop complaining, but he forces everyone to eat an ice cream, and Wanda and Eric just end up nearly on their deathbeds, and he's bacteria right. Problem, yeah, and obviously that can be a problem in many places of the world where it can't be kept cold and whatever. And he's absolutely fine. They're on their deathbed, and he's like, what's going on? Stop all this fussing around, and that's kind of a theme that carries on for most of the book, but he doesn't get completely away with it.
Just a quick note to say that if you enjoy the podcast, please leave a review on your favorite podcasting app, or consider supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support. Right. And so they travel through Istanbul to Tehran, and I think this is where Wanda leaves, and she has a plan to meet Eric back in Italy, I think, after their little tour. And this is just so people can get a sense of, pacing. We're at chapter 8 by now, right? So we're up to chapter 8, and they're still not walking in the Hindu Kush yet.
And actually, the title's a little bit misleading in some ways, because they don't walk in the Hindu Kush till the very end,
Right.
But it's interesting you say about pacing, because I think that this is something that Newby's very good at. Well, I mean, one of the problems I have with, I don't know, problems are a harsh way to say it, but I think sometimes that travel writing can become, travel literature especially, can become kind of so enamored with itself and its own journey, and so much depth and background, that it sort of loses the pace a little bit, and it becomes it can become quite dense at times. And Newby, I think, is really good at pacing. If there doesn't, if something doesn't need to be explained or elaborated on, he just moves on, and he's quite good at that, I think. So I felt reading it that, even though it takes quite a long time to kind of get to the meat of it in some ways, he's quite tight in his overall pacing and writing. You sort of move from one anecdote to another, and he breaks it up well with dialogue and characters. So there's not long passages of exposition which really slow down the text too much. So it feels to me like it reads like a bit of a page turner, like almost like a bit of a thriller at times,
Yeah, it's kind of like a classic travelogue, right? We don't, as we mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of kind of cultural or historical insight here. And in fact, I think this is chapter 7 or so. There's this kind of weird break where there's a disclaimer that says, and I have the quote here, it says, "Readers who are not interested in the history and geography of Nuristan should leave off here and start again in chapter 8, which kind of gives you a good sense of what the book is about. I mean, you're not going to read this to, to learn about the region. You're reading this to hear the story, right? And what you said earlier at the top of the conversation, that Newby is an incredible character, I think cuts to the heart of what this book is about and the reasons why we read it. It's because this is a story between Eric Newby and Hugh Carless and their characters and their journey more than any cultural or historical book, right? We're not going to get that same sort of insight.
No, but I think you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really good insight, that, he's written this in such a way that you've really, by the time you leave England and set off on this adventure, you are absolutely on Newby's side and Hugh's side, and these characters. Even though you haven't spent that much time with them, you know them. You've kind of befriended them,
right?
You laughed with them and at them a little, and you're kind of with them on this journey. You want them to succeed, and I think that he's also written it really with the reader in mind. I think sometimes it's easy, particularly with travel writing, to it can be hard to cut out parts of a journey that were maybe very meaningful to you or important in terms of understanding the destination, but they don't necessarily help with the core narratives, the core story that you're trying to tell. And I think Newby's really good at writing with the reader in mind. Like, he wants to write an entertaining story, and that seems to me what comes first to him. What are the things that are going to be fun and entertaining for my reader to read, and then kind of base the story around that and those anecdotes. By and large, I have a few not complaints, but a few places where I think that falls down a little towards the end, but I think by and large he does that very, very well. But it is really funny and jarring, that part, isn't it? Because at that part I was quite into the story and everything, and then all of a sudden you're ripped out of that illusion, and it's like, and he almost apologizes for providing the history, and it was quite sort of jarring and unexpected.
Well, I thought it was also unexpected, but for me, this is the point where the book improved for a strange way. Like, I think I opened the book expecting to read those types of things, and, to have it as basically a footnote, a parenthesis apart from the main story. Of course, that's jarring, but, that's what I guess I expected. And maybe that says a lot about me as a reader, the type of books that I prefer. But the book vastly, in my opinion, improves from that point forward.
Yeah, no, and I didn't mean jarring in the sense of that to have it. I felt that it was just jarring to announce his apology that it was just about to come,
Right.
So
that's strange.
I would have preferred that to, I suppose, be written through in some way. There's a lot of journey that happened where elements of that could have been woven into the narrative more seamlessly than that, and probably more successfully ultimately. But yeah, one of the reasons I picked this book was because it's such a fascinating region, and it's still a very remote and in many ways unknown region. Of course, though, it's been so terribly affected by war for most of our lifetime, and I think that, that's one of the reasons I wanted to find out about it too. And I suppose that if I have a complaint about the book, I think that Newby does the kind of expedition adventure side of it incredibly well. I think he's a very fun writer, but I felt sometimes like culturally that there were elements missing. And I don't know if you got that too.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I suppose on one level, it's what you're mentioning in terms of the kind of background in the exposition that kind of sets the scene of the place a little. I would have liked to have known a little bit more about that, I suppose, overall. But also I felt sometimes he writes characters incredibly well, and you have people, that appear later in the journey, like Abdul Giyas and the kind of 3 Afghan horsemen that they commissioned to join them on the expedition. And although he writes that quite well, I always feel like there's a little distance between them. I don't know that I ever feel that he really connects with them on a person-to-person level.
Agreed.
And certainly as we progress into Nuristan, I mean, it gets to the point of being kind of ridiculous and almost rude and hard to read at times, that his distance and almost his disdain for some of the attention he's receiving. And I felt that was kind of a shame. I felt like he'd embarked upon this great expedition, this great mission to explore this uncharted region, but almost seemed uninterested or unable to connect with the people on a sort of deep level.
Right. Well, in some ways, the story was about Eric Newby, right? It wasn't about the people of this region. And, to the point that we mentioned earlier about Hugh, it put me in a weird place to read about how Hugh constantly berated and chastised some of the local people, right? There's a series of incidences that occurred where Hugh just sets off and starts yelling, in some cases lying to these people. There was an instance somewhere towards the end of the book where they first encounter some of the locals from Nuristan, and there's of course this great picture in the middle of the book that shows some of these people, and it says the caption reads, Nuristanis, see 2 British people for the first time in their lives or something, and they befriend Hugh and Newby, take them back to a village and bring them into one of their houses. And there's this weird scene with the Rolex watch where Eric takes off his Rolex watch and he's bragging about that it's waterproof and that it's brand new, and they kind of drop it into a vat of boiling soup or something, and one of the guys fishes it out and kind of disappears with his watch, and he suspects that this guy's going to steal the watch. So he goes there and he yells at them, and it rubs me in the wrong way, that someone would go to such lengths to visit such a kind of remote and wonderful region of the world and essentially not give a damn about the people who he's encountering.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I wanted to. I'm glad you brought that up because I really wanted to bring up that scene too, and in fact, the whole of the 4th section of the book, the Nuristan section. But I totally agree. I mean, it was like we built up this whole moment of crossing into this kind of magical land, Nuristan, the country of light, and then we get there, and the moment happens, where like you say, these guys come bounding out of the house, and for a moment you think there is that cultural connection that, they take them back to the bothy, and there's going to be finally that connection, and that moment where the countries meet and the different worlds meet, and something profound happens, but it sort of turns, and Abdul Giyas is like their guide, really, the leader of their kind of caravan has all these prejudices. They all do, that, you know, against the people of Nuristan, and then calls them murderers and robbers. And it's almost like those prejudices win out in the end, you know, that rather than forming his own opinion. I mean, so many times they disagree with Abdul and the team, right? So many times they berate them and force them on, you know, almost against their will. And yet when it comes to this moment and moments like that, they sort of bow to that sense of, oh, you're probably right. They probably are murderers and robbers, all of them. And it just felt really unfortunate that they would sort of succumb to that kind of stereotyping and I guess kind of racism. And yeah, I thought it was a real missed opportunity in the book. And in fact, you know, just to jump ahead, I guess, I felt like that whole fourth section was a missed opportunity in a couple of different ways. You know, the book is originally set up about exploring this region, Nuristan and northeastern Afghanistan, and you're kind of brought to be excited to see it. But then through kind of Hugh's suggestion, it also becomes about climbing this mountain, Mir Samir. And structurally, I thought the book suffered because he's obviously written it chronologically, which is fair enough. But you kind of climb this mountain, you go through this whole big adventure, and then it's almost like an afterthought. They end up going into Nuristan. You know, I understand the need to do things chronologically, but I also think that you can present things that make sense for the narrative in a way, and it might have made more sense, narratively speaking, to have, you know, experienced something of Nuristan and built up to that moment on the mountain. You know, not to say that he should change what the order in which stuff happened, although, you know, a lot of travel writers do that. But it as a narrative, it didn't make sense. It fizzled out because they'd already had the peak moment, and then they just seemed tired by the time they got to Nuristan, and they seemed a little fed up. And there were moments like where they were just clearly annoyed by the attention they were being received. You know, they were clearly annoyed that people would come and watch them and want to get to know them. And it's kind of like, well, what did you expect? You know, you've decided to go to this region where that's barely had any visitors, that has no roads, that, you know, almost no one can access. You know, what did you think was going to happen when you arrived? You know, this is why you've come. You should have been aware of this, or at least you should be polite enough to appreciate it from their perspective, and you know, empathic enough to appreciate it from their perspective. So I think that section, missed out a bit for me. And it started, as you said, with that scene with the watch and the binoculars, and what could have been this beautiful cultural exchange became them accusing these people of robbing them. And it's kind of left unclear as to, just to explain what happened, that he wants to prove that his Rolex watch will work even in the soup or whatever. But then it gets covered in the soup, and one of the guys takes it down to the river, and it seemed to me like he might have just been washing it off in the river for him, you know, and having a look. Yeah. And but it was just assumed that he was going to steal from him. And it's that kind of stereotyping and sort of implicit prejudice which kind of pervaded that section of the book.
And he grabs his wrist, like he forcefully grabs his wrist and kind of snatches him. And I think some of that might have been informed by the Afghani guides that they had, because they were feeding this narrative that they were going to rob them and then kill them, and that they couldn't camp there at the night because that's what would transpire. And so in the back of Newby and in Hugh's mind, they're thinking they're going to go through our stuff. They're going to steal all of our stuff. So, yeah. And of course, there's the other debacle when after they leave that towards the end, they're trying to, the one that you mentioned earlier, that they're trying to forge the river, and there's an easy pass. But I don't know, things happen, and one of the horses gets submerged in water entirely, and all of their equipment, nearly all of their equipment and gear gets soaked. Film, cameras nearly destroyed, and Hugh melts down. Right?
Yeah, it was a tricky scene. I just felt by then that they'd expended so much energy doing the mountain, and they just seemed tired and grumpy by that part of the story, and ready for the journey to finish. And even if they felt like that in real life, I think it should have been written differently, because as a reader, all that happens is, because you've now bonded with them and you're now seeing this story through their eyes, all that happens is you now feel tired and grumpy and ready for the journey to end.
Right.
And that's kind of not how you want to finish a book, you know.
And it ends abruptly, right? They meet, this great explorer, Wilfred Thesiger, who he and his caravan are going through the region, and they just kind of happen upon him, right? And he invites them, noticing that they're British, invites them to camp together, right? And there's this kind of a classic scene, the very last line, where Thesiger is setting up his bed, and Newby refers to the ground as sharp and rocky, and Thesiger is just going to bed, setting up his bed on these hard rocks, whereas Hugh and Eric are inflating their air mattresses, which I didn't know they had with them, right, until this point. Right. And they're inflating their air mattresses, and Thesiger says to them, "You guys must be a couple of pansies." The end, right? And
I know. I love it. Honestly, that whole, the whole fourth section of the book I wasn't sure about, but I was redeemed when I read that ending. I mean, I know some people won't like that because it's very abrupt.
Right.
And, some people be like, what happened? Did they make it back okay? Well, obviously it's assumed they made it back okay. And I just think that's such a perfect ending. And I love how he ends quickly like that. And it just says that's like the full stop, the final point that he needs to wrap up the book and kind of make fun of himself and Hugh. And I thought, I don't know how you felt about it, but I loved that. I read that and I just laughed out loud all by myself and just thought, brilliant. Just a really brave way to end a book. And I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, no, it was a funny end, and in some ways kind of ties the book together, because we get this image of Eric working in the fashion industry, completely ill-prepared to go on such a quest, bumbles his way through, basically throughout the Middle East, and, meets this famed explorer who mocks them for being ill-prepared, right? And it's this nice kind of, the dots are connected nicely. But in terms of structure and narrative, there is that kind of abrupt end, and I'm not sure. I felt like, shouldn't there be more to the story here?
Well, I think for me that was a product of the way the whole end was structured in terms of the mountain and the passage about going into Nuristan. Nuristan ended up just becoming this kind of meaningless annex to the book, because the whole thrust of the narrative was about climbing this mountain. And then once that was complete, that's where the book needed to wrap up. Narratively, they should have gone through Nuristan, climbed the mountain, come down, seen Thesiger, called them a bunch of pansies, and off they go. That the end, that would have made sense. But also, sort of in typical Newby fashion, there wasn't internal sort of subjective looking at what this meant or what it felt like, and that's what left it a little bit empty at the end. Was, it was very much a sort of jolly boys' own adventure and having a bit of fun and making fun of themselves, and unfortunately at times some of the people they met along the way. But there wasn't a real sense of what it meant to him after all this, or what it felt like, other than that physical exhaustion and endurance. And so, having put us directly inside his head and his thoughts, I felt that we deserved a little bit more intimacy at the end, something about what it meant and how I think travel writing at its best should take you on a internal as well as an external journey, and you should learn something along the way. And I sort of left wondering what he learned, what changed about him as a result of this journey. And
we don't know.
And we don't know. And I don't know if he knew. And I don't, do you know what I mean? Yeah. I think that what was fun to go into this journey naive, because they had this kind of aristocratic English arrogance, meant that they still had that arrogance at the end. And actually that's not much of a journey, Yeah.
And this, I keep on coming back to the Ricky Gervais idiot abroad an analogy, because, we don't watch that show to learn anything about the places the idiot Carl visits. We don't watch it for any of his insights. We watch it for the idiot. We watch it for Carl. In some ways, that's why we are reading this book. It's for Newby, right? I don't want to call him an idiot, but the analogy, he presents himself as underprepared, bumbling, traveler. And so I think that way to think about this book might be revealing. We're coming upon the hour here, and I don't want to hold you for much longer, but can we just close this conversation out by asking the question, overall, did you like it? Would you recommend it?
Yes, I would. I mean, with those qualifications, I think that it's always hard to read something that was written. Well, this was, written 60 years ago, and so much has changed culturally in that time. I think there are elements of it that grate a little bit, and there's elements that leave you feeling a little bit unsatisfied. But I think you have to understand it is of its time. And, it's particularly as someone from England, I think I was able to laugh at that sort of stereotypical, English gentleman a little bit, and also sort of understand where it's coming from. I'm not sure. I mean, as an American, did you understand that persona and see it as a kind of almost as a caricature, or was it sort of a bit more confusing and misunderstood for you?
No, I definitely picked up on those class conversations that are going on there. I definitely picked up the very kind of British quality to it in terms of the humor and approach. I'm sure some things were lost on me just because of the cultural differences, but it did come across as that.
And so I think that, taking that to one side, I think, and that's the case with a lot of classic literature in any case, but taking that to one side, I think that one of the things about travel writing or good travel writing is the person that you're traveling with, the person that you're sort of traveling in the mind of, has to be good company. And I think Newby, that all that criticism aside, is still good company. He's funny. I think he's thinking about you, the reader, when he writes. He's trying to entertain you. He's not doing it in a kind of, self-indulgent way, which is easy to fall into for sure. But I think you need to read it, as you said, with a sense of this is a kind of fun yarn. This is a sort of fun, bumbling story. It's kind of a classic of anti-mountaineering or something, I would say, if you're a serious mountaineer, it would probably really make you laugh.
Right.
But but nonetheless, it's a great adventure story. It's great fun. There's some really funny scenes. Like, we didn't mention this, the one scene where, with the baby, when they stop in the village and there's these women that are screaming they're screaming, baby, baba, 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 and they're looking down this well, and it's this well of like sewage, that deep sewage, and Newby's just like, this is the moment that's finally arrived. This is the moment. My whole life has been building up to this moment to be this hero. And he just rips his shirt off and dives head first into this vat of sewage and is swimming around the bottom of this disgusting sewage trying to find this baby. And then he pops up and the mum's holding the baby. He's like, oh yeah, sorry. She had just run into the house next door, So, there's funny scenes like that throughout. I think it's they're great company to travel with, and I would recommend it. And it makes me want to read some of his other stuff too. I think he's just good fun to be with. And if you're not looking for something too heavy or too serious, if you're looking for just a fun story and a bit of a page turner rather than a really deep understanding of a country or a culture, then this would probably be a good book for you.
I agree 100%. And on that note, we should wrap this up. Thank you so much for suggesting this book and coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, man. I'm a big fan of your show, and it's an absolute honor to be on and chat about this great book with you.
You can find the episode show notes and much more at travelwritingworld.com. Please remember to subscribe to the show in your favorite podcast app. And if you find the show valuable, please please consider leaving a review or supporting the show with only a few dollars a month at travelwritingworld.com/support.